In 1909, 3 men reportedly went underground in the Arizona desert looking for silver. What they came back describing wasn't silver at all. According to a single newspaper account from that year, they described tunnels that weren't natural, chambers cut with precision no prospector's pick could explain, and passageways that seemed to run for miles beneath solid rock. Then, according to the same limited record, all 3 men went quiet. No further interviews, no follow-up reports, no verified names that historians have ever been able to confirm. Just one strange story, printed once and never fully explained since. This is the story of a claim almost impossible to verify, almost impossible to fully dismiss. To understand why this story took hold the way it did, you have to understand Arizona in the early 1900s. This was a territory, not yet a state. Statehood wouldn't come until 1912. And it was defined by exactly the kind of frontier energy that produces both real discoveries and tall tales in equal measure. Prospectors moved through the deserts and canyon country by the thousands, chasing silver, copper, and gold. Some genuine wealth. Most found hardship, and a smaller number found nothing at all except stories worth telling back in town. The Grand Canyon region, in particular, had already developed a reputation for the unexpected. Its geology is genuinely strange to the untrained eye, layers of exposed lime sandstone and shale going back nearly 2 billion years, carved into shapes that don't always look like ordinary erosion. Real caves do exist throughout the canyon system, some documented, some still unexplored, even today, by professional speleologists. It's a landscape built for legend, simply by being as vast and unknowable as it is. Indigenous peoples of the region, including the Hopi and Havasupai, have their own long-standing oral traditions regarding the Grand Canyon, traditions describing it as a place of spiritual significance tied to origin stories and to the passage of ancestors. These traditions deserve to be understood on their own terms, as sophisticated belief systems developed over many centuries, not as evidence for or against any particular sensational claim. It would be a disservice to reduce them to a footnote in someone else's mystery story. Into this landscape, in the early spring of 1909, came a report that would outlive almost everything else printed in Arizona newspapers that year. According to the account, published in a regional paper and widely reprinted since in popular collections of unexplained history, an expedition had been quietly funded to investigate reports of unusual tunnel systems somewhere along the Colorado River within canyon country. The story described a network of interconnected chambers allegedly containing artifacts unlike anything associated with any known regional culture. Metal implements, carved figures, and rooms of a size and precision suggesting deliberate construction rather than natural formation. It even claimed connections to ancient Egyptian or Asian civilizations, a detail that, even at the time, should have raised immediate skepticism, given the total absence of any other archaeological evidence supporting transoceanic contact that in the region. Was this simply an elaborate piece of early 20th century fiction, dressed up as journalism to sell papers? That's the most likely explanation, and it's the one most professional historians and archaeologists have settled on. But the story didn't disappear the way most invented tales from that era eventually do. It kept resurfacing in later decades, in radio programs, in early conspiracy literature, and eventually across the internet, gaining new life with each retelling. At the center of it all were the 3 men who supposedly made the discovery. Their names, as reported, don't hit any verifiable government expedition record, mining claim, or scientific survey from the period, a detail that matters enormously and one we'll return to. So if these men were real, why does no verifiable trace of them exist? And if they weren't, why has this single uncorroborated story managed to survive, almost entirely intact, for over a century? Let's walk through what the original account actually claimed, because the details matter, and because separating the claim from the century of embellishment around it is the only honest way to examine it. According to the 1909 newspaper report, an expedition, described as having some connection to a prominent American research institution, had been exploring a remote section of canyon roughly evident from the Colorado River, reachable only by a difficult overland route. The article claimed the expedition had been underway for months prior to publication, funded quietly, without public announcement, which is itself unusual for any legitimate scientific undertaking of that era. The three men credited with the discovery were said to have located an opening partially concealed by rock, leading to a descending passage. Following it, according to the account, revealed a shaft dropping some hundreds of feet, connecting to horizontal tunnels branching in multiple directions. The article described room after room, some allegedly containing mummified remains, others containing tools and implements of copper and a harder, unidentified metal. If true, a discovery of this scale would have been one of the most significant archaeological finds in American history, arguably more significant than anything uncovered in North America or since. That alone should us pause. Discoveries of that magnitude leave a trail. Research papers, museum acquisitions, follow-up expeditions, institutional records. This one left almost nothing but a single newspaper page. The article claimed the expedition leader had briefed institutional representatives and that further excavation was planned, pending funding and government permission, since the site apparently sat on federally managed land. And then, nothing. No second article. No named institution ever publicly acknowledged funding or knowledge of the expedition. No records of a permit request survive in any archive historians have been able to locate. What happened to the three men themselves is where the story becomes almost frustratingly thin. According to later retellings, not the original 1909 account, but versions embellished over subsequent decades, the men reportedly declined further interviews, citing instructions from the institution allegedly overseeing the expedition. Some retellings claim one of the men left the region entirely and was never traced again. Others claim all three simply stopped discussing it publicly for reasons never fully explained. It's worth pausing here to be direct. We do not have verified biographical records for these three men. We don't have birth records, mining claims filed under their names, or any government correspondence confirming their existence in the historical record, independent of this one newspaper story. That doesn't necessarily mean they didn't exist. Record-keeping in territorial Arizona was inconsistent at best. But it does mean the entire foundation of this story rests on a single, uncorroborated source. And yet, here's the detail that keeps this story alive for researchers who take a more measured approach. The newspaper account is real. It genuinely was published in 1909 in a real Arizona newspaper, and it genuinely does describe an alleged expedition in specific, confident detail. Details a typical hoax of that era rarely bothered to include. Most sensational fiction of the period was vague by design, easy to write and hard to disprove. This account unusually commits to specifics, approximate depths, described chamber counts, and directional details about tunnel orientation. Does specificity make a claim true? Absolutely not. Skilled fabrication often benefits from specific detail, precisely because it sounds more credible than vague claims. But it does make this particular case an unusually well-constructed piece of either journalism or fiction, and that construction is part of why it has easy dismissal for over 100 years. If a story this strange has survived for over a century without ever being fully confirmed or fully debunked, you can probably guess why it still gets discussed today. Subscribe now, because the investigation into what actually happened next gets even harder to untangle. So what does the historical record actually say, beyond the original article itself? This is where things get genuinely difficult, and where I want to be as careful and transparent as possible. No major American research institution has ever publicly confirmed funding, authorizing, or having any knowledge of an expedition this description in 1909. Institutions of that era, including several prominent scientific bodies, did conduct real archaeological and geological work throughout the Southwest during this period, but none of the verifiable expedition records from that decade describe anything what the 1909 article claimed. That absence of confirmation is often treated online as evidence of a cover-up. I want to push back on that framing, gently but firmly. The absence of institutional confirmation is exactly what you'd expect if the story were fabricated from the start, which remains, by a wide margin, the most historically supported explanation among professional archaeologists and historians who have examined this claim. Extraordinary claims of this scale, if genuine, tend to leave extraordinary paper trails. This one left almost none. There's also the matter of geology and archaeology working against the claim on its own terms. The rock layers described in the region, in many areas, geologically ancient limestone and sandstone formations, and while natural cave systems absolutely do exist throughout the canyon, no verified cave system matching the scale, complexity, or artificial construction described in the 1909 account has ever been documented by modern geological surveys, cave researchers, or archaeological teams working in the canyon over the past century. That's a meaningful point. Modern cave exploration technology, GPS mapping, and decades of scientific survey work throughout Grand Canyon National Park have been extensive. If a chamber system of the scale described genuinely existed, and had genuinely been explored as thoroughly as the 1909 account claims, it's reasonable to expect some later trace, even indirect one, to have surfaced in the centuries since. None has, at least none that meets any reasonable evidentiary standard. So why hasn't this story simply faded away, the way most unverified newspaper claims from the early 1900s eventually do? Partly it's the specificity we discussed earlier. Partly it's the setting. The Grand Canyon is one of the most mythologized landscapes in America. Vast enough, there might be something we haven't found yet, feels intuitively plausible, even to skeptical minds. And partly, it's simply the nature of a good unresolved story. Humans are drawn to mysteries that were never definitively closed, far more than to ones that were. There's also a more uncomfortable possibility worth naming honestly. Some researchers have suggested that the original article may have been intended, from the start, as a piece of imaginative fiction common to that era's journalism. Regional papers occasionally published speculative or fantastical stories without clearly labeling them as such, blurring lines that modern readers would find unacceptable in journalism today. If that's what happened here, the mystery isn't really about lost chambers at all. It's about how easily an unlabeled piece of fiction can outlive its own context and be mistaken for history, generation after generation. That's a sobering thought. But it doesn't fully resolve the question either, because we still don't have definitive proof away, no confession from an author, no internal newspaper record explaining the story's origin, nothing that closes the case entirely in either direction. There's a loosely related thread worth placing alongside this story, not as proof of anything, but as an honest widening of the picture. Throughout the American Southwest, other reports, separate in time, separate in location, have occasionally described unusual underground formations encountered by miners and surveyors, some going back to the mid-1800s. Most of these accounts describe natural cave systems, explained through conventional geology once properly surveyed. A small number remain only partially explained, often due to areas being resealed, restricted, or simply never revisited by later researchers. None of these separate accounts directly reference or corroborate the 1909 Grand Canyon story. They exist independently in different decades, involving different people in different parts of the region. But the broader pattern, isolated reports of strange undiscoveries, followed by silence, missing documentation, or an inability for later researchers to relocate the original site, appears more than once across regional history. Is that pattern evidence of some larger hidden truth running beneath the Southwest? Almost certainly, the more mundane explanation applies in most or all of these cases. Difficult terrain, poor record-keeping typical of that era, cave-ins altering or sealing original access points, and the simple tendency of frontier storytelling to grow more elaborate with each retelling, decade after decade. But the shape of the pattern is still worth noting carefully and without over-claiming. A story doesn't need to be true to be culturally significant, and it doesn't need external corroboration to say something real about how people in genuinely remote, unexplored country processed the unknown parts of their own landscape. Whether or not 3 miners ever stood in an artificial chamber beneath the Grand Canyon in 1909, the fact that so many separate frontier accounts describe some version of "we found something," and then we stopped talking about it, tells us something about the psychology of discovery in genuinely uncharted terrain, even if it tells us very little about geology. So where does that leave the story of the 3 miners? Historically, the most responsible conclusion is also the least satisfying one. We have one newspaper article, published in 1909, describing an extraordinary discovery that no subsequent archaeological, institutional, or geological record has ever corroborated. The men at the center of the story cannot be independently verified to have existed. No excavation site has ever been definitively located, despite over a century of curiosity, amateur searching, and eventually widespread internet attention. By the standards of historical evidence, that's not a mystery with 2 competing explanations of equal weight. It's a single uncorroborated claim, and the burden of proof sits heavily against it. Professional archaeologists and historians who've examined generally treat it as almost certainly fictional, likely a product of the loose journalistic standards of a particular era, rather than a suppressed archaeological discovery. And yet, a small, honest space for uncertainty remains, the same space that exists at the edge of almost any story built entirely on a single historical source. We can't prove a negative with total certainty. We can't fully rule out the possibility that something, somewhere, prompted the original story, even if that something was ultimately far less extraordinary than what was printed. History is full of exaggerated accounts built loosely around a kernel of something real, and full, too, of stories invented from nothing at all, simply happened to feel plausible enough to survive. What we're left with, ultimately, isn't a confirmed lost civilization beneath the Arizona desert. It's a question about how stories take root, how absence of evidence gets filled in by imagination, and how a 100-year-old newspaper page can still generate genuine curiosity today, long after everyone involved in writing it has been gone for generations. Maybe that's the real subject of this story, not what three men supposedly saw underground in 1909, but why we're still trying, all these decades later, to decide whether to believe them. So, do you think there's any kernel of truth in that 1909 account, or is this simply one of history's most durable pieces of frontier fiction? I'd genuinely like to know what you think, so drop your take in the comments below. And if you enjoy carefully researched mystery deep dives like this one, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what we dig into next.